Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, resilience, crisis management, COVID, well-being, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Alternatively, you can find me at alexfullick.com. Today is part 3 of my talk with Shane Mathew. Shane, welcome back.
Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
We've had great conversations with our first 2 shows, and our third one, something tells me you and I are on the exact same page with this one, because I haven't been very shy at all over the years how I feel about some of this. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this topic, because we're going to talk about the ideal BCP. Right? And that I know there's people listening right now going, oh yeah, but it needs this, and this, without even us saying a word. You just know it.
Right.
So I'll just ask you straight out. What does the ideal BCP look like to you?
If I could make it into a one-page checklist and there was just, very little additional fluff in a document like that, I would be in love. Hopefully that's where you're aligned too.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think in my 15 years of working in this industry, I've been a part of quite a few incidents in I have never caused them, but I've been a part of several incidents, right? So I don't think I've ever really seen people pull out a plan and utilize a plan in the midst of the disruption, at least in the way you would think people would do after all the investment of time we tend to see in what I would say the traditional business continuity planning documents. So yeah, my philosophy is, keep it simple, stupid, as much as possible with your planning.
So what kind of things end up in a BCP that really shouldn't be there? Or has no need to be there?
Right. Yeah, I think what you end up seeing is that plans become very prescriptive, and they oftentimes will try to anticipate every single potential scenario that they could possibly face, right? There was an interesting psychologist that I used to follow I still follow, Gary Klein. And he, in one of his books, talked about how in the 70s and 80s, the U.S. Army spent considerable amounts of money building very complicated response plans for their for their teams, for their units, right? And what they ended up finding was, after spending millions of dollars on these documents, that nobody was using them in the midst of the training or in the actual need for those plans. And so they hired Gary Klein to go in and investigate and find out, why are you not using the plans we've created? And they found that oftentimes the plans were not able to address the scenario specifically enough that these individuals were facing. And oftentimes they would instead focus on what they called the commander's intent. And the commander would give a objective. I want you to go capture this city by 1,200 hours. And you have whatever resources you need, but get that city captured. And they would modify their practices and establish tactics and procedures to accommodate that objective, right? Mm-hmm. So what Gary Klein ultimately determined was that you can't be prescriptive and accommodate every single scenario. There's never going to be enough paper to capture every single scenario. So why bother trying? So I think instead you have to focus on establishing a clear set of how you solve crisis or business continuity emergencies, and train people on that methodology, as opposed to trying to come up with every scenario.
Should that mean that a BCP should be kind of general in nature rather than specific?
Well, I think it has to be kind of a mix of both, all right? So the idea here is that your plan should be flexible enough and organized in a way where the business continuity response team can follow the same methodology every time, and they can do it from scratch. If there was no other plan, like I like to think of it this way, if they couldn't get access to that paper document or online document, would they be able to initiate a business continuity response? And the answer is, if it's long and drawn out, no, they would forget everything in the midst of battle. But instead, if they had a set of steps that they would always follow, then they can apply that logic to any scenario. Now, that being said, I think there is value in developing, for the most likely scenarios, a series of pre-thought of objectives and strategies on how do you address those. So in my plans, I tend to put both in, right? I tend to put in the framework that people know, if I have nothing else in my hand, these are the 4 steps that I follow, or excuse me, 5 steps that I follow. And then additionally, I have tables where they would have a series of, hey, if this happens or something like this happens, here's the most likely objectives that we should try to attain. And again, it's very simple, and it's not giving every single detail, but instead just helps them jog their memory about what they should be thinking about, as opposed to tells them how to jog.
It gives them the ability to adapt themselves to the situation they're surrounded by, rather than trying to figure out in a 700-page binder, where is the page that addresses this situation?
Right. Absolutely. I think that happened to me one time, and I learned my lesson quickly that we had a scenario in which it was a bomb threat that caused an evacuation in a building, but it was caused by a security guard accidentally hitting the wrong button on their mass notification system. So we didn't have a scenario that said accidental evacuation. What do you do, and how do you communicate, and how do you do accountability, right? So you had to call an audible at that time. And so that again reiterated the fact that you can't prepare for every scenario, even these types of weird ones that show up every now and then. You have to be able to quickly pivot and call an audible and just run through your main action items.
Well, I'm glad you just said that, because my question was going to be, should the plan, whether it be 1 page or 5 pages of stuff, should most everything be in there be action oriented?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a book I read called The Checklist Manifesto. Some of your readers have heard it, right? That influenced me a lot too, because in the midst of a major event, breaking things down into checklists are by far one of the best ways and easiest ways to make sure you don't miss anything, right? So I think in general, you have to get to that level of, can you make a checklist out of this? That would be the ideal for the various components of your response. Now, I'm sure I'm hearing the screams of listeners who may be saying, but I can't turn in a checklist to the auditor who's coming to see my program, right? And I totally get that. So what I've started to do is put these types of tools that I would use in the midst of a response at the beginning of my plan. And at the rear of my documentation, it was the boilerplate things that you generally have to have to pass an audit, right? So your scope and your objectives, and some of the things, there's some auditors that are very stringent and want to see this, and this, and they are not willing to listen to my ramblings about checklists, right? So they want to see certain components. And so what I ended up doing, I learned this from a client, is to flip it on its head and put all the meat that I would want my teams to use in the midst of an emergency at the beginning of a plan, and then put all the additional items that you may need to satisfy those critical auditors at the back. But generally people go to the first couple of pages and they're set. They got what they need for a response.
Yeah, I've known people who said if they can't find an action item in the first 2-3 pages, they just close whatever that binding document is and will just go forward. They can't be bothered.
Exactly.
And another place I worked at, it's interesting you talk about the flip there. All that boilerplate information, they started recording in a central location for every one of their plans. So you went, I think it was a spreadsheet or something built into something online, and business continuity plan, last reviewed, who reviewed it, and added a signature, everything there. And it was all taken out of all their plans. So the plans went from 50 pages down to 10.
Right.
And suddenly people started paying attention. Oh, I can manage this.
Yeah, I think that's a key factor you've hit on, Alex, is that people get overwhelmed, and especially if the document requires tables of contents and you got to flip around the pages to find certain pieces of information. I mean, honestly, another thing people tend to do is put in additional information, but beyond the boilerplate, they'll attach their BIA results or risk assessment results to their plan. And then now you got like 100-page document, right? But I'll be certainly willing to talk to people who think I'm wrong. But I've never encountered anybody saying, "I wonder what our BIA says," as the critical process. And do they really go in there and say, "Well, here's our 4-hour RTO. Let me start this stopwatch and get ready to watch the clock go down," right?
Yeah.
Rarely does that happen. So why spend time investing in building a plan that contains all that additional information?
Yeah, and no one ever says, oh, I need something to do. Let me read a 500-page BCPS. No one does.
I haven't seen that.
It also must make it easier having these streamlined plans to actually validate them or exercise test, I should say. That would make it easier too, would it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main takeaway for me has been, they're much more able to walk through a plan in advance. When I meet with teams to say, hey, let's do a refresh and look through and verify that these steps that you've indicated still make sense. Again, you're going through a very short series of documents as opposed to nobody wants to review objectives or other things that are superfluous. They want to jump into that very tangible and helpful series of information in a plan. So it helps for checking plans later too.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's got to help with maintenance and continuous improvement rather than trying to, because then you're updating boilerplate stuff too. And if you make a change in a boilerplate in one place, well, guess what? Now you've got however many other plans to make that update too.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, there's people that have software tools that help with that. There's other shops that I've been in that where we were doing Google Docs or Microsoft Docs. So I like your idea about that centralized document that has all the general information. Because again, you're simplifying your job too. Why do you want to spend time updating documents when the real brand value of your program is solving problems? So why make that a big issue for yourself either?
Yeah, I remember doing that at a site, a client site where they had everything in one spot, and auditor came along and I just, hey, here's a spreadsheet. It's full of links to the plans. I said, come back if you have any questions. They never came back.
Yeah, that's good.
I couldn't believe it. Wow, audit has no questions? That never happens. So we're coming to the end of our segment talking about the ideal BCP. Do you have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to convey?
Yeah, I think it's so helpful to pilot these types of things before you launch across an organization, right? Because you get a feel for what's working and testing it. I'm a big fan of piloting things before you go mainstream. So what I like to do is I build a bare minimum plan and have the participants conduct a walkthrough or scenario-based discussion just cold and see how they do. And, I'm measuring things not just about their ability to respond, but their ability to navigate the documentation that I've prepared for them or with them, right? So I'm looking at their ease of use. And that's a question I ask often at the end of the session. How did you like the plan? Like, did you find it challenging to navigate? Do you have any improvements that you would suggest? Any data points that are missing? And then from there, launching wider once you've learned a bit. So that would be another thing I would say to wrap up is don't hesitate to focus group things, right? We tend not to think of our programs as needing focus groups, but it's very important because once you launch a format and it gets out to all these enterprise-wide business units, as you mentioned earlier, changing things later is a tremendous challenge. So that would be my last bit of encouragement is to keep things simple and test before launching any type of plan out to your larger, broader groups.
Well, that would make sense too, because like we said in one of our other shows, that would get the buy-in and participation of people so that they're actually getting something they know they need and they know they can use because they're part of the development.
Right. The more advocates you can make that are going out to their peers to say, yeah, the process was easy. Shane's amazing. He's hilarious. The more you can get that, the more and the easier it is because they do talk and word travels fast about your processes.
Yeah, if people don't like something, you hear about it. I worked in restaurants many years ago, and if we had one upset customer, well, I know they told
a lot of
other people.
Yeah.
So, because it would come back to us and we'd find out, like, how'd you know about that? So, yeah, so it can happen, Shane, thanks very much again. I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise again and talking about the ideal BCP. And I was right at the beginning. I said, I got a feeling you and I are 100% on the same thoughts, and we are.
Good. Good.
I don't like all that fluff. You even used my word that I call all that stuff fluff.
Fluff. Yeah.
That's it. I give me the meat and the bones. I don't want the fluff.
Right. So. Absolutely. I'm glad that you invited me on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, I'm glad you were able to join us today. I really appreciate it. And everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.